Now that we have seen the finished site, it's time to start building the site ourselves. All the features you saw were purely done using nothing but HTML5's out-of-the-box features. I haven't used any third-party frameworks to do all this. All comes with the HTML5 standard. I think no HTML5 course is complete without showing the new HTML5 logo somehow. So there goes. Just like the many new HTML5 features, it also has a new fancy logo. We won't be staring at the logo for too long. Instead, let's see what HTML5 brings to the table. HTML5 is the newest version of HTML. It actually replaces HTML4, which was born many years ago, even before the year 2000. So effectively, this means that we have been using the web for so many years with nothing more than what HTML4 could give us. HTML5 is much more than HTML4. For one, the HTML5 standard is not just some new elements, it's in fact a collection of standards. HTML5 is therefore not only HTML. Instead, also JavaScript and CSS3 are part of the new definition. HTML4 was quite limited, and yet we have survived on this small standard for so many years. How did we manage? Well, the answer was plugins. The web became interactive through the use of plugins such as Silverlight or Adobe Flash. With HTML5, plugins are not going to be needed anymore. The standard is trying to make everything which was possible before with plugins only available out of the box. For the web user, this is good news, since he doesn't have to make sure that he has the newest version of the plugin installed. And for the web developer, this should also mean less headache. We're living in a world of devices. The use of websites from devices is higher than it is from desktop PCs. We therefore need to make our sites so that they are displaying information correctly both in the desktop browser and on smaller screens. We all know that Windows isn't the only operating system being used today. HTML5 is one solution of building cross-platform applications. Most of the features we'll see in this course will work in most major browsers as we speak. One important thing to note here is that HTML5 sites mostly still work in older browsers. The experience won't be optimal, but most things will still render correctly. The HTML5 definition was created by the W3C and other working groups. Along the way, they sort of merged their efforts, and HTML5 is the result of their work. On this slide here, I've summarized most features that come with the HTML5 standard. Of course, we have the new HTML5 elements, form controls, and attributes. Very often people think HTML5 is nothing but some new tags. Well, they couldn't be more wrong. There's the new embedded CSS3 standard. We have support for rich graphics with the canvas and SVG. The canvas is using a JavaScript API to create interactive graphics, whereas SVG allows us to create vector-based drawings. Audio and video are baked into the platform as well, allowing us to playback media without the need for plugins to be installed on the system. There's now the ability to work with files and storage. The File API allows JavaScript to work with files. Using the Storage API, we can store data on the local device, which gives us many more options than what cookies allowed us to do. It's also possible for HTML5 apps to use the offline support. Using this support, users can run a cached version of the web application. Drag and drop allows us to pick up elements and drop them on a different location. Microdata allows us to nest metadata into web pages, which in the end can be used by browsers to give users a richer browsing experience. These are the most important features which are included in the HTML5 definition. There are other features which you'll often come across which aren't really part of the HTML5 standard, but are very often seen as being a part of it. The web SQL and the indexed database API allow us to work with a database implementation from a web page. I've already mentioned the ability to work with files from JavaScript. Again, this isn't really part of HTML5 itself. And the same goes for the background worker API, which allows us to create long-running tasks from the browser. In a later module, I'm going to cover the geolocation API, which itself isn't part of HTML5 either. This one, though, is very often considered as a real part of HTML5. Finally, WebSockets are again not really part of the HTML5 standard, but are part of the new features we're getting with this release. In general, whether a feature is part of the HTML5 standard or not is not something that should keep you up at night. If the feature is there and it is supported in most major browsers, there's no one stopping you from using it. Now that you have an idea on where to situate HTML5 and that you know what it is and isn't, it's time to get practical. As promised, we should end up with a basic HTML5 based site at the end of this module. So let's get straight to it. We're going to start building the skeleton of the HTML pages. As such, an HTML5 page is nothing more than an HTML page you've probably already worked with. Like previous versions of HTML, HTML5 pages contain tags. Tags can be seen as building blocks for the pages. There are quite a few tags available, each with their own functionality. Some tags have a visual meaning, while others don't. A tag such as h1 or an input tag are visual tags, while a meta tag, used to indicate metadata for the page, is not a visual tag. Using the tags, we build up the HTML document. The HTML code we see here on this slide shows a very basic page with a head and a body inside of HTML tags. Inside the body, we create the structure of the page. Using just plain tags, we won't get very far. We'll need some CSS to enhance the visuals and JavaScript to add interactivity. We can link JavaScript and CSS files with this page using the script and link tags as shown here. In the previous slide, I haven't talked about a big difference between HTML5 and previous versions. Remember in HTML4, we used to have to include a complex doctype declaration as shown here. This was pretty complex, so that almost everyone copy-pasted it from somewhere. With HTML5, this is now simplified to just doctype HTML as shown below. I already mentioned that very often people associate HTML5 with the new tags which were added. Like we already saw, there's much more to it than just some new tags. However, it's interesting to start by taking a look at these new tags which are now supported. We're coming from HTML4, which had a number of well-known tags out of the box. These include the doc type, the anchor tag, the paragraph, UL and LI for lists and list items, and so on. The div or division is a very popular tag, which is very often used in combination with CSS for layout and styling purposes. The object tag also used to be in high demand. It was the tag used to embed Silverlight or Flash plugins. The form, of course, is also very common. It's the tag which makes the web interactive, allowing users to send and request data. Inside the form, we use the input tag, which has a number of types defined, such as text for a plain text box or radio for a radio button. Let's now look at the newly added tags. We're going to start by looking at the newly added so-called semantic tags. Now, what is a semantic tag? Let's take a look at that first. I've placed a quote on this slide here. A div is just a div. Now, what does that mean? We all know that modern web pages are very often constructed using div elements. In itself, a div is just a block with no meaning at all. Now, when looking at web pages, most pages have a header div, a footer div, and so on. So this div then gets its meaning commonly through the use of an ID or a class. Now for software such as a crawler or screen reading software, it's not always easy to identify which div contains which particular information. Sometimes the ID of the header div is head, sometimes it's header, sometimes it's page header. While we as humans can easily figure that out, it's harder for an automated process. The problem with these divs is that by default they have no semantic meaning, so a div remains nothing more than a div. Now enter the new HTML5 semantic elements. With HTML5, a number of semantic elements has been added. The name of the elements in most cases gives away what they are to be used for. For example, a header tag is to be used for page or blog header information. This means that inside the header element, we can place the logo and the navigation menu, for example. However, what the header doesn't do is adding any visual behavior. It's not because we place element inside of a header that this content will be centered on the screen and made bold, for example. Far from it. The header behaves just like a div, but instead it gives its contents semantic meaning. And that goes for most tags that you see here on this slide. In the following slides, we'll take a look at some of these tags in a bit more detail. Let's start with the article and the header. Like I already mentioned, the header is commonly used to place page or blog header information within. In this example here, we are placing the header within another new element, the article. The article is, as the name implies, commonly used to wrap things such as a blog post or a user comment. According to the HTML5 spec, it's a piece of content which can stand on its own. The new footer element is used to wrap page footer information. This often contains contact information, a physical address, and so on. In the sample here, we have a page on our site with a footer, and in there we have contact information for the creator of the page. The section tag is a very interesting one. It's probably the one which lies the closest to the original div, and it's very often used where a div would normally have been used. However, there's a difference. The HTML5 spec describes the section as a piece or block of content on the page. If the container is there just for layout purposes, we should use a div instead. So if the container is there for layout purposes only, then use a div. If, however, the content is a separate section on the page, use the section element. So in the sample here, we have a number of coffees with their description. A section is better than a div here, since the separation is based on content, not styling. Another new tag with no visual representation is the address tag. As you can infer from the name, it's used to wrap address information. But again, it is not because content is inside an address tag that it is laid out differently. It's just semantic meaning. We're saying that the content is effectively an address. The aside tag is another interesting one. As the name implies, it's used to wrap content which is related to the main content. So on a page we can have an article with the main content, and next to that we can have some related information, which is not really part of the main block of content. That related information should then go in an aside tag. In the sample here we have an article about coffee, and inside of the aside block we have some trivia about coffee. The new figure and fig caption are often used incorrectly. The figure tag is to be used to wrap an image which is related to the main content. It's not correct to replace each image on your page with a figure. Only use the figure when it's referred to from the content. The fig caption can then be used to add some information below the image. Here in the sample code we have a figure wrapping indeed an image, and a fake caption is used to add some text below the image. The summary and detail tags are a bit of an edge case. For starters, I wouldn't recommend using them, since at the time of creating this course, they aren't well supported in most browsers. So what is their purpose then? A summary details block should be displayed as an expanding element. The summary is always shown, and the detail is opened when the summary is clicked. Here we see a screenshot of the summary details in Chrome, which is currently the only browser supporting these tags. The elements we have seen so far are all block elements. Next to the new block elements, there are some new inline elements being added to HTML5 as well. As a small reminder, an inline is typically displayed without starting a new line first, whereas block elements normally start and end with a new line. The new inline elements include the mark, the meter, the progress, the output, and the time. Let's take a look at the most relevant ones in a bit more detail. And let's start with the mark tag. The mark tag is typically used to highlight content. You could use this to draw the user's attention to something, but also to highlight content based on a search query entered by the user. In the sample here, we're using the mark tag to emphasize that the store will be closed. The default highlight color is yellow, which you can change through CSS. The next element is the meter tag. As the name implies, this tag is used to represent a value within a range or a fractional value. Typically, we could use this to show a percent of completion, how much space the user still has in his cloud storage folder, for example. Here in the sample, we're using the meter tag to indicate how strong a particular type of coffee is. This is indeed a fractional value. Now, closely related to the meter is the progress tag. You would use the progress tag to specify progress of a task. As you can see from the sample on this slide here, where we are using the progress tag to show how far the user is in the checkout process, that the meter has a visual representation, and it is dependent on the browser. The last tag to take a look at is the time tag. The time tag has again more a semantic meaning. It has no visual representation. It, for example, doesn't change the UI to display a clock. What it does do, however, is making sure that the time indication is machine readable. For example, here in the demo code, we are using the time tag to make sure that, for example, a search engine knows the date indicated with the text Christmas Eve. Now that we have seen several new tags in HTML5, it's time for the first real demo. In this demo, we are going to create some pages making use of the new HTML5 tags.